Welcome to Daily Dose of Knowledge. Some people love with everything they have and still end up alone. Not because they loved wrong. Because they loved too much, too fast, and from the wrong place. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. This one will change how you see love, fear, and the patterns you keep repeating. There is a theory in psychology that explains more about your relationships than almost anything else. It is called attachment theory. And it begins not with who you love as an adult, but with who raised you as a child. In the 1960s, British psychiatrist John Bowlby proposed that human beings are biologically wired to form deep emotional bonds with caregivers, not as a preference, as a survival mechanism. The infant who stays close to its caregiver survives. The one who wanders does not. The brain builds its entire model of relationships from those early bonds. What safety feels like. What love looks like. What to expect from other people. That model becomes the template. And most people carry it, largely unchanged, into every relationship they will ever have. Bowlby's colleague Mary Ainsworth later identified distinct patterns of attachment through a landmark experiment called the strange situation. She separated infants from their caregivers briefly and observed how they responded to the separation and the reunion. What she found was that children clustered into distinct patterns: secure, anxious, avoidant, and a fourth, more disturbed pattern she called disorganized. Each pattern reflected something about what the child had learned to expect from the people they depended on most. Secure children had caregivers who were consistently responsive. They were distressed by the separation but easily comforted by the reunion. Avoidant children had caregivers who were emotionally distant or dismissive. They learned to suppress their attachment needs, to need less. Anxious children had caregivers who were inconsistent. Sometimes present, sometimes absent, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, with no reliable pattern. And those children learned something specific from that inconsistency: that love is uncertain, that it can disappear, that you must monitor it constantly and fight to keep it. That lesson became a way of being in the world. A script running beneath every relationship that followed. This is anxious attachment. And it is one of the most painful ways a human being can move through their emotional life. The anxiously attached person does not experience relationships as a source of security. They experience them as a source of perpetual threat. Not because their partners are threatening. Because the brain, trained on inconsistency, is permanently scanning for signs that love is about to disappear. Every unanswered message is evidence of abandonment. Every shift in tone is a signal that something is wrong. Every moment of distance is the beginning of the end. The brain interprets ambiguity as danger because that is what it was trained to do. The nervous system of the anxiously attached person is in a state of chronic low-level alarm inside relationships, always braced, always monitoring. Psychologists call this hyperactivation of the attachment system. The system meant to seek comfort has been turned up so high it cannot switch off. And the behaviors it produces, the checking, the reassurance seeking, the inability to tolerate uncertainty, are not neediness. They are survival responses. They are what a brain does when it has learned that connection is unreliable and that losing it means losing everything. Now let us talk about what anxious attachment looks like in adult relationships. Because the infant patterns do not stay in infancy. The anxiously attached adult falls fast. The early stages of a relationship feel intoxicating. Finally, connection. Finally, someone who sees them. But beneath the intoxication is terror. Because the brain that expects abandonment cannot simply enjoy what it has. It immediately begins watching for when it will be taken away. So the anxiously attached person begins testing. Not consciously, not deliberately. But the need for reassurance is so constant that it bleeds into every interaction. Are you still interested? Did I say something wrong? Why did it take you so long to reply? The questions vary. The underlying question is always the same. Are you going to leave me? And the tragedy is that the behaviors produced by this fear often create the outcome they're trying to prevent. The constant reassurance seeking exhausts partners. The jealousy creates distance. The emotional intensity early in relationships frightens people who are not ready for it. The anxiously attached person pushes away the very thing they need most, not because they are broken. Because their nervous system is running a program written decades ago for a very different situation. There is a specific dynamic that anxious attachment creates in relationships. Researchers call it the anxious-avoidant trap. Anxiously attached people are often drawn magnetically to avoidantly attached people. And avoidantly attached people are often drawn to the anxious type. The anxious person needs more closeness than the avoidant can provide. The avoidant person needs more space than the anxious can tolerate. Each one activates the other's deepest fears. The anxious person chases. The avoidant withdraws. The chasing triggers more withdrawal. The withdrawal triggers more chasing. The cycle escalates. The relationship becomes a battleground of two nervous systems, each doing exactly what they were trained to do and making everything worse. And yet they stay, because the intensity feels like love. Because the relief when the avoidant finally returns feels like proof that it was worth fighting for. It is not proof. It is the intermittent reinforcement cycle again. The same mechanism that drives slot machine addiction. The same mechanism at the heart of trauma bonding. The anxiously attached person often mistakes the pain of the cycle for the depth of the connection. The more it hurts, the more it must mean. The harder you have to fight for it, the more it must be worth having. These equations feel true. They are neurologically false. Now let us talk about where anxious attachment comes from. Because the caregiving inconsistency that creates it rarely looks like what people expect, it is not always neglect in the obvious sense. A parent can be physically present and emotionally unpredictable. A parent struggling with depression, anxiety, or their own unresolved attachment wounds may be warm and engaged one day and withdrawn and unavailable the next. The child has no way to understand why the warmth disappears. They have no access to the parent's internal state. They only experience the inconsistency. And the conclusion the child's brain draws is not that the parent has a problem. Children do not have that perspective. The conclusion is, I am not enough. I am not consistently lovable. I must try harder, monitor more carefully, be better, and maybe then the warmth will stay. That conclusion, I am not enough, becomes the operating assumption of the anxiously attached person's emotional life. It shapes who they choose. They often choose partners who confirm it, who are emotionally unavailable, inconsistent, or require constant effort to stay engaged. Because familiar feels like home, even when home was painful. Now let us talk about what changes this, because attachment style is not a life sentence. The research is clear on this. Attachment styles are working models, not fixed traits. They can be updated, not easily, not quickly, but genuinely. The first mechanism of change is what researchers call a corrective emotional experience. A relationship, romantic, therapeutic, or deeply platonic, in which the other person is consistently available, consistently responsive, consistently safe. Not perfect, just reliable enough that the brain begins to update its model of what relationships can be. This is slow. The brain does not revise a deeply held model quickly. The anxious person will test the new relationship, consciously or not, against the old template. They will look for the inconsistency they expect. And when it does not arrive, when the person stays, when the reassurance is given without resentment, something begins to shift. The second mechanism is therapy. Specifically attachment-focused approaches that address the original wound rather than just the surface behaviors. Understanding where the pattern came from does not eliminate it immediately, but it creates distance between the person and the pattern. The anxiously attached person who understands their history can begin to observe their own responses rather than being completely driven by them. They can ask, is this person actually withdrawing, or is my attachment system firing a false alarm? That question, small as it seems, is the beginning of genuine change. The third mechanism is self-regulation. Learning to soothe the nervous system independently rather than outsourcing that function entirely to a partner. The anxiously attached person's nervous system has learned to regulate through another person. When the other person is unavailable, the system destabilizes. Building an internal capacity to tolerate uncertainty, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing without immediately seeking reassurance, is not comfortable work, but it is the work. And it is the only work that addresses the mechanism rather than just the symptoms. Anxious attachment is not a character flaw. It is not evidence of weakness or immaturity. It is the predictable result of a nervous system that learned love is uncertain. That lesson was learned in a context that no longer exists. From people whose limitations had nothing to do with your worth. The pattern served a purpose once. It kept a child close to a caregiver who might disappear. That purpose is gone. What remains is the pattern. And patterns, with the right understanding and the right support, can change. Not into perfect security overnight, into something more honest. A way of loving that does not require constant monitoring. That does not mistake intensity for depth. That can hold space for uncertainty without treating every silence as a goodbye. If this gave you something real, subscribe to Daily Dose of Knowledge. Drop a comment with what you recognized about yourself or someone you love. Explore our videos on psychology, human behavior, self-help, science, history, relationships, and the forces shaping modern life. There is always something here that will shift the way you think.